Hello and welcome to this Soul Leader podcast series for authentic leadership from the heart with me, Nadine, broadcaster and journalist, and joined by Rasheed, who's a coach, speaker, author, and founder of Soul Leader. Now, in each episode, we lift the lid on an important and often challenging issue in leadership life, but always through the lens of being authentic, heart-centered, and compassionate. So, for this podcast episode today, I'd like to ask you, Rasheed, about imposter syndrome. And we're going
Mm.
to unpack it. We'll lift up the bonnet, let you have a good look around it, and then get some top tips for you to share with people listening to this or watching it on YouTube on imposter syndrome.
Mm.
So, Rasheed, are you up for the challenge?
You know me, I'm always up for the challenge. I love these kind of topics. Yeah. It's an interesting one, actually. Let's just say that imposter syndrome is a very interesting one. And I say it's interesting because I've been a coach for over 20 years now. And when I first was coaching, the words imposter syndrome weren't said that often. Words like confidence and so on were, and they're kind of often related, or they can be have different nuances. But imposter syndrome is something that comes up a lot when I am giving talks, running leadership development programs, etc., etc. And it's an interesting one because I'm wondering if it's something that almost like the common cold that can sometimes seem as though it's catching, or people will describe it to many things that may or may not be the same thing. So with imposter syndrome, it's really important that we begin to kind of unpack and do lift under the bonnet and think, actually, well, what do we mean and what we're talking about when we mean imposter syndrome, and then to begin to explore how we move forward from that. So I'm really looking forward to today's topic.
Yeah, you're right, actually, because it's something that, there are books on it now. It didn't exist. Well, it probably did, but it didn't have a name for it. And actually, let's start then by finding out what exactly is imposter syndrome. So, how would you define it? What's your take on it?
Yeah. So I guess it's interesting that even defining it, that for each person, including many of the people who are listening to it, that they might think, oh, yeah, that's me. I've got imposter syndrome. But when each person kind of describes it, it might look quite different to them in terms of the very specifics of what's going on for them. But very often, that imposter syndrome, it's a kind of a sense that it might well be for some people, am I good enough? Am I ready? I seem to be different to everybody else here. Am I as experienced or skillful or ready as everybody else? Am I the only person who looks like me, thinks like me? All sorts of things. Or am I worthy of this that's happening to me? Or, all sorts of different variations of those kind of themes. It's interesting also because generally in my experience, that imposter syndrome, or using that word imposter syndrome, I hear it more often, that women will often say it far more often. Maybe that's also because sometimes for women in the workplace, they're more likely, not always, that there may well be so many different hats that they have to wear and different roles that they may well be having to perform at work and at home. They're more likely to be a key carer. They're more likely to be, in many situations, looking after the kids or the main personal responsibilities here or there. There are just all sorts of different dynamics where that is often one component, although not always. But I would say, in my experience,
Yeah.
it's a large percentage.
Or without going off too much on a tangent, they don't see role models within the business themselves and actually have to
Right.
fit in, and then their values, their ethics and everything go out of the board, and then you start doubting yourself, and that imposter syndrome could set
Right.
in. Maybe not all aspects of it, but certainly some,
Right.
because it's different, like you said, for many people. Yeah.
Right. And so you've got that. So whereby it may well be for women, or if you're somebody who sees in any way that I don't look like many of the other people in the organization because of my age, because of my race, because of my ethnicity, because of my gender, because of my sexuality, because of the way I think, or because of my size, my shape. There might be so many different factors, or I don't look the same way that other people do, that there can be just so much that can be going on there. And it's interesting about that word then, imposter syndrome, and to I kind of want to dive in and share, Nadine, something that I often share when it comes to this, and it might kind of unpack some of the other things that you'll no doubt quiz me on, is that I often say people to begin to nip this in the bud, because often it's given us just one term, one term. I'll often say to people, if you've got the job, you're not an imposter. And if you've been invited into the room or the meeting or whatever, or the project, you're not an imposter. And even if you were, that's dealing it head on. So in one way, you're not imposter because you're invited. But even if you were, what is it that you uniquely bring to that room? Because there isn't anyone else who looks like you, thinks like you, or does things your own way, or speaks like you, or has your personality that enriches that room, that organization, that team, that project, by virtue of you being there that wasn't there before. So I think there's a lot here. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, when I was just thinking about what topic should we do today, I know it's back in the 70s, there were a couple of psychologists who first described imposter syndrome in high achieving businesswomen. So that's where the basis of it actually came from. And since then, experts, you've dealt with, coached thousands of people through your workshops, through your courses and your coaching sessions. It's common in all genders and many lines of work. But again, like you said, it has other elements as well, whether it's ethnicity, backgrounds, whether it's to do with sexual orientation, whether it's gender. There's all sorts of things that come into play here. But actually, something else I found out that going back to good old scientist Albert Einstein.
I'm now scared that I'm really scared the fact that I invited Nadine Dereza, the journalist. No, I'm loving it. No, I'm really loving it. It's great. It's great hearing all of this
No,
stuff.
that 82% of, as many as 82% of all people felt like a fraud at some point. So I think let's unpack it further, because imposter syndrome might ebb and flow. It might be there as a constant. It's going to be varying from person to person. But you mentioned about confidence as well. So how is imposter syndrome different from confidence? Does that make sense?
That it does, and I think that's a really, really good question. I think sometimes they are used interchangeably, and I think that sometimes, we might come back to this at another point, but language can be really interesting, and the language that we say and that we use to ourselves and with others. So we've got a whole range of differing things here, and potentially different kind of symptoms and things that may well be going on. It's a bit like sometimes when you're unwell, and then many of the things may have similar symptoms: the headache, the fever, and think, oh, that's me, oh, that's me, that's me. Because sometimes, so if we kind of unpack, maybe what might be good for us to do again is to unpack some different threads, different things that can be there when we're talking about things like imposter syndrome and so on. It might kind of help us and help the listener to kind of navigate their way round. Are we talking about confidence? Are we talking about the competence or the skills that you might feel you need to do the job? Are we talking a little bit about whether you feel supported or safe? Are we talking about that you're the only person who looks like you or thinks like you who is in that particular kind of a room? Do you feel as though sometimes that other people are part more of the in crowd? Is it a cultural thing? Is it personality? There can be all sorts of different dynamics here. So I think that it's interesting when we, in a previous episode, Nadine, we were talking about, and we'd started off by looking at the importance of being authentic. The beauty of that, and for people who haven't listened to that episode, I would say that for many people, that episode will be useful, because sometimes if we're being authentic, it allows us to value what I uniquely bring to the table. So sometimes with this whole thing around imposter syndrome, there is something about, do I myself see myself, my skills, my magic, and what I bring to the table that might well be unique or different to somebody else? So that inner piece of work may well be very important to do, is to remember. Then we talked about the inner and then the outer look. It might be that you need to be looking at, okay, what's going on? Are there other people who look like me or think like me? Is it my perception? Is it something where I'm going to need to have conversations with other colleagues and find out, or other people in other organizations or similar roles, and feel if they're feeling the same thing as me? Because often, Nadine, one of the things that's worth flagging up at this point that I find when I'm coaching people and when I'm running those leadership programs you pointed to, and it is common across the board, many people do not see their own magic and their talents. They don't see the gifts that they bring to the table. And it's important that they do, in order that they're also able to be aware of it and to help that for others. So there's a lot, again, that's going on here that may well be going on when we just label it imposter syndrome. And sometimes parking the label imposter syndrome, sometimes, and thinking, well, what are the constituent things that you're describing here, may actually be more useful than just saying imposter syndrome that we just accept.
Yeah,
And it's like with
one
procrastination.
size doesn't fit
Yeah.
all, does it?
Yeah.
So, and actually, it can be, a psychological pattern which is characterized by that self-doubt and that all-encompassing fear of being unmasked as a fraud, or it could actually be down to certain workplace scenarios. It could be delivering a presentation and the stakes are high. It could be leading a high stakes project. It could be facing a performance review. So actually, just saying imposter syndrome doesn't really tackle what is really happening
Sure.
under the bonnet. But equally, and that's where that over 80% figure comes from, is that it could be just from now and again that people have those symptoms of imposter syndrome, which are really real and affect their ability to
Yeah.
lead, because that's really what it's all about, really, isn't it? It's the impact that it has on your leadership skills. So
And you
from a
point, and you put, yeah.
yeah, from
Well,
a
you,
sole leader perspective, sorry, Rasheed, why then is it important to address imposter syndrome? So when you're coaching leaders, how do you actually approach the subject of imposter syndrome and get them to open up how they're really feeling? Because like you said, it could be about situational things, or it could be all encompassing.
yeah. I think, and that thing that you just mentioned there, and that at that tail end there, was so useful, because is it situational or is it all encompassing? So I think for anyone who's already listening and gripped and really thinking, oh, that's interesting, or that's me, or this, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, or all of these things. The first thing I would actually say to do is actually think about, if for you, is it situational, in which case, which situations, or is it constant, I'm feeling that? And then let's keep a note of that for when we come back to the tips and as we explore this topic. I think when I'm running workshops and talks, actually often it's really interesting. What I would do is it's important I create a safe space that people can just very open up and share how they're feeling and what they're wanting from the program. And it's amazing the number of times that people will just open up and say, for me, it's confidence or it's imposter syndrome. And they are probably the most common things that the challenges that people will present to me. That I guess in terms of the challenges that can be, I mean, on an individual level, it could be just sometimes that you're just second guessing yourself, you're doubting yourself. You might be really stressing a lot about things. It might be that you are perhaps spending, I don't want to say necessarily too much time, but too much energy. It can be a lot of emotional energy. It might be that you might be finding actually there are times that you're having to play shy on yourself or show up kind of slightly differently. So it can be playing out in terms of that authenticity side. So it can make that impact there. But I also would say, as a leader, it might well be that with it not being looked at, it might well be that when other people who may well have the same thing, if you don't kind of begin to think, as with anything in leadership, any trait or any challenge that you have, if it's not something that you're able to kind of look at and compassionately, which is really important, it might mean that when other people have got similar challenges, you may not, as a leader, pick up on that or be able to, or feel confident about supporting them that. So the chances are, if you feel like that, other people, and it's a bit like, Nadine, it makes me think a little bit about this, a bit like when we step back and things a bit like presenting. Often when we teach things like presentation skills, some people often might well say, well, I'm not good at this, I'm not confident, I'm not like that. And then other people, even in the room, might think, oh my gosh, I thought you were extremely confident, and so
Yeah.
on. So sometimes your own perception isn't also the reality in terms of how you are, how you show up, your performance. and so on. So again, this is where, you've used it in our podcast already a number of times, that word about that self-awareness. And with the soul leader spends a lot of time in being very clear. Who am I? What am I about? What are my values? And taking a lot of time to self-reflect, actually. And the self-reflection, both alone and also then as we begin to over time develop that peer network. I mean, was it just me in that meeting? I felt a little bit like, or I felt as though when I said that, and then when somebody else said it 10 minutes later, that you've got something to be able to measure it, because otherwise you don't want to just be stuck into your own perceived self-diagnosis that's something that may or may not be true. Or as you've, and this again links to the powerful thing you've said about, okay, is it situational, whereby it is only when I present that I feel as I'm imposter, it's only when I've got to go to the senior meeting, or is it all of the time that I feel like that? Because it might be a skills thing, it might be a competence thing, it might be a cultural thing that people haven't made you feel welcome, or people are, or it might be a microaggression where people are, there may well be, so we need to really name it what it actually is. And as valuable as a catch-all as imposter syndrome is, I think it doesn't necessarily help. It's a bit like, Nadine, I was going to say before, when people say to me sometimes, I procrastinate. I procrastinate. Well, when you say what are you talking about? What do you mean? It might well be that you're not ready. It might well be that you're unsure. It might be that you haven't got the information. It might mean that you're tired. It might well mean that you are waiting or you're delaying things. It could be a whole range of things that we have just labeled procrastination. What do we mean? And this is why I say with language is so important. I have a saying that language is our greatest contribution to understanding and misunderstanding.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and like you said, I mean, imposter syndrome, you're just doubting your own skills and successes. It can ebb and flow. It's not necessarily a fixed state, but it's not a mental health diagnosis, but it can really cause harm in different areas of your life. And, if you think your career success is due to luck instead of your skills and hard work, you may be less likely then to a promotion or raise. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that often, um, thinking about the gender split, that men will get promoted on potential, whereas women will get promoted on experience. And therein lies the gap, because partly because women haven't had the same, as we've discussed before in another podcast, the same leadership opportunities.
mm,
you know that is being addressed, but it's still a long way to go to get that parity of esteem, to get that parity of opportunity. So already there you can see how imposter syndrome can manifest itself if the structures are in place where men don't need the experience to get a job, it's just their potential, but women have to say they've got that experience to do the same job. Now, I know I'm generalizing there, but I've seen those patterns at play. I've chaired panel discussions around that. And if women in the workplace are having breaks for whatever reason, then coming back as well,
mm.
that's when that self-doubt, that confidence, and that's where imposter syndrome, it means different things to different people. But it is an important one to address. But I imagine even talking about it's got to probably be one of the hardest things to speak up about.
Mm.
And I don't know about you, if you're doing a group session, do people actually admit to it in a group session, or is it something they wait until they've got you privately, or it's an individual session they're doing with you?
I thanks for put all those things you put on the table, Nadine, because I think they're so powerful. First of all, you're right that there can be those things that we experience that um, that we're experiencing within the culture of the particular organization or a particular sector. Are we finding time and time again that, be it for women or people for a certain background, cultural thingy or class, are having to prove themselves time and time again? Are there those things that are happening either organizationally, industry wise, and so on, that can have that impact? There's a couple of models, and I'm not a social scientist, but there are a couple of models that look at all the different things that impact us on as human beings. So there's kind of our personal, then there's this thing about the, I'm I'm using my hands. So people who are listening to the audio, you're just going to have to imagine that I'm doing these circles that are getting bigger and bigger, starting with an inner circle
He's
going to
doing
an
it
outer.
beautifully as well.
Exactly. So there's the kind of the personal, then there's the interpersonal of your relationships. And if you can then imagine the next circle out, it might be the organizational, and then you might have the institutional, and then they might get the cultural and the structural. And you can see that in many things, when it comes to things like gender, when it comes to race, and many other things, that all of these different things may impact. And we might personally just personalize that I'm this, when it might actually be, actually, that's what I'm finding out in my relationships. That's what I'm finding out in my organization, in my team. And then structurally, when I join this organization and so on, we can see those, the structural, the organizational, the structural, and the interpersonal. So sometimes we might need to really unpack these things and think, actually, where is it? Is it something that's unique to me? Is it something that's unique to this particular team? Because it could be that in the next team next door that I'm not. I'm going to this meeting and I feel completely comfortable on you. This time I'm doubting myself. I do feel the imposter syndrome because there may well be all sorts of different dynamics that you talk about that are going on. Is it just that it relates to, is it a thing where I'm actually feeling that imposter because I've taken 9 months out since being pregnant, since I've been on maternity leave, and then taken a couple of extra months to do X or Y. There may be all sorts of different things that it may well that may well be factors that are at play for you. Some that might relate to you, some might relate to your circumstances, some relate to skills and so on. We're all on that journey. Interestingly, picking up on then that question really then directly, it's really interesting, Nadine. When I'm running leadership skills, often people are, particularly programs, when I'm running a program over a long period of time, I ask people what they want to do. People often are very much at the beginning will just offer, actually, for me, it's about confidence. So that and that therein lies another lesson. If you are a leader, if you're a senior leader and you're creating the culture, a soul leader creates a culture in which people can open up and they can talk. And it might be just in that one-to-one, that people can say, oh my, how are you doing? Oh, you know what, Nadine, thanks so much. I've now been here for 6 months. I feel as I'm okay on this, but I'm really not sure about that, because you've created the conditions in which I can really open up. So the soul leader does that. They create the conditions in which people can really open up about how they're actually feeling. And a good soul leader can really help that person on that journey. No, you created that. You're really good at blah, 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 and help us be it with the confidence, the competence, the skills, the training, the development, or whatever it is that we need. So the soul leader is responsible not just for their own development and making sure everyone feels safe, honored, valued, and sees their magic and their skills and their talents and their competence and all of the rest of it that this stuff points to when we're talking about imposter syndrome and how they're welcomed and whether they've got the networks and relationships that they need. But they're doing that, they're doing that within the organization because they know how they felt. So again, if you felt like that as a leader in your journey, or you're aware of that, you've got a responsibility as a soul leader. You can begin to be making that difference. But it's good we've identified that there could be all of these different things going on, which helps us to begin to think, aha, what is it that I'm going to need to do to make me feel more better about myself, whether it's some self-development, whether it's with teams, whether it's getting some support, whether it's me asking deeper questions about, do I really want to be here? Because also, sometimes linked next door sometimes to it, sometimes what can happen, and it's next door, but it can kind of seep into it, is where people's confidence dips over time because of their lived experience within an organization, that they feel devalued. It might be after that career break that you said, or the maternity leave, or because of a certain project that has dipped their confidence in some way. They might then call that confidence rather imposter syndrome. Interestingly, imposter syndrome may be more likely to be that somebody calls it when they're newer to a team or to a role or a project. If they're more established, they might call it confidence or other things, interestingly, because the imposter, is more like, or if there's been, so it's often at that moment, if you think about that word imposter, would tend to be often earlier when somebody's kind of come in generally, although not always.
Yeah, I don't particularly like the wording, but it is what it is, and people know it now as imposter syndrome. And as I said, if people, many people out there will have been affected by it, will continue to, and it will affect the way that they lead and they manage, and for all sorts of different variety. It could be when they receive criticism, that's when it kind of
Mm,
kicks in.
mm,
When they're joining a new leadership team,
Mm.
and you're having to constantly question yourself whether you're capable of, guiding the team effectively or being part of a new leadership team, even though you may have excelled in those roles before. Comparing achievements with other people as well, and social media, that becomes more prevalent now as a result of that. I mean, it could be that you're in a team of experts and you start doubting your own
Mm.
expertise.
Mm.
Mention about public speaking, or when you're giving a presentation, that sort of anxiety. Receiving a promotion, you question whether you truly deserve it. Networking events, for some people, that is their nightmare events. They're not networking
Yeah.
events. You feel
Yeah.
inadequate and struggle to engage with people. All of those things and so much more. I'm sure some of those things have resonated with people, but they will affect the way you lead or manage, won't they?
They really will. I think there's something here about, and this is where some of the soul leader principles are kind of very useful. There is something about maybe a good starting point here for if somebody's been listening to this and they've heard the things that we've already talked about and some of the ways in which you've highlighted where they can impact. I would say this is where what I would call compassion, and some people now also call self-compassion. For me, compassion is compassionate, and it begins at home. I call it self-compassion. Being really kind and caring to oneself is really important. What are the things that you're kind of saying to yourself? Being on your own side is really, really important, because be it that it is confidence, be it is that imposter syndrome, be it any other thing, that in the leadership journey, it's really important that you're able to be kind to yourself. And also, it's going to be really important that you can give yourself a fair and adequate score sheet. By which I mean, sometimes the language that we start to use with ourselves, I'm not good at this, I'm rubbish at that, or if you'd heard somebody else say that, you might take them to HR. I mean, the things that people say to themselves, do you mean you might take them to HR? And I think this is very important also when it comes to leadership, because you've got to be able to, you're wanting to be able to, you're wanting to be able to give that really fair and really balanced feedback to your team and so on. So to address whatever we've called it is going to be important for you and for others, and to make sure you get that job that's yours, or you can go for that promotion, or that you are able to articulate the skills that you bring to the table that otherwise you might not have done. There are elements here about the things that are about personality. Some people might have a style where they might be far more quiet, or they don't shout about things. Other people may or may not. So there'll be all sorts of different dimensions, things at play in terms of your personality. This is where sometimes where things like some of these personality tests and so on can sometimes be useful, or again, just a good peer network of those people, or mentors actually. So sometimes actually with some of these things, mentors, and particularly something like an imposter syndrome, and a good peer network can be really useful, because they can be a really good space where you've got that space where you can show up, pause, breathe, get that affinity, get some feedback, get some support, feel comfortable, feel valued, feel reaffirmed. You get in many organizations things like also staff networks these days, which is often where then people of the same, not always necessarily exclusively, but by whatever criteria you are looking at yourself through that lens, that might be that there might be a race network, a women's network, a disabled staff, a long-term carers network. Sometimes actually it's being in some of these spaces where people who may well have some of the same characteristics or challenges, where you're definitely not an imposter, can be really useful. So you can speak about and breathe and air some of these issues. And actually that can be a very, very good measure of actually, oh my goodness, it's that. And then actually, is it that you're an imposter? And then, remember, this is why I go back to my initial definition. If you've got the job, if you are invited onto that project, you're not an imposter. So what we've got are actually then other things, may well be very serious, that are going on either for yourself or for others, or thinking, but it means that we can then begin to deal with what it is, because it might actually, you're faced with microaggressions, or the culture of the organization isn't supporting you, or you yourself have just not had that space or that support to value yourself, or it might just be your personality, your style is that you don't speak up about those particular things, and you might need a little bit of development because now, as a leader, as a manager, the culture is that you speak up your achievements. So Nadine, it's so good that you've unpacked also some of the ways that this can impact on people and some of those other threads that somebody can actually think, well, hang on a minute, what actually is this above the sniffles or whatever I'm thinking about this
Yeah.
cold thing is, or these symptoms that I'm describing it? What actually is going on here?
What's going on? Yeah, indeed. And some people, well, many people wing it, and actually sometimes you have to, because you have to react in the moment. Some people over prepare, but I think we've all over the years sort of had to suddenly do something last minute. Thought, oh gosh, I just about got away with that. But then you think, well, actually no, because it's all the experience and the skills that have brought you to that moment. And again, one size doesn't fit all here. But you started to give some really good practical advice
Mm,
about reaching out and talking to people and finding those networks as well, so
mm.
that you can share what's going on and then think, oh gosh, I'm not alone here. What other practical advice and tips would you give to somebody who feels this way and wants to change their relationship with imposter syndrome? Can you make inroads into this straight away?
Yeah, such a good question. I think that some of these tips are going to relate to things that I would say are really essential on your leadership journey. So there are going to be some things that are going to be important for you on your leadership journey, and especially on your soul leader journey. Because if you're somebody who's wanting to be authentic and wanting to be true to yourself and wanting to make an impact and a difference in the world, and sometimes with things like imposter syndrome or other things, it may well be because you genuinely care and you're wanting to do really, really well, which is why you may well put an additional lens or pressure on yourself. So I think one of the first things I would say is that recognize that culturally, in many cultures around the world, we're recording this in the UK, it can be there true in much of the West and all sorts of other parts of the world. We tend to be taught to see life through the lens of either lack or what we should have. So what that does immediately is means that I'm looking through the lens of, oh, I could be better. Oh, I'm not quite as good as that person. You think about the people who might be getting their exam results, or the person who's we constantly are seeing things through that lens of that comparison. So that's one thing to first of all clock and notice that what can happen is it may well be that culturally that there is an element of that can go on that can kind of mean that we're already um, pressurizing ourselves or feeling that we're not good enough or that we're feeling inadequate. It's there. We tend to see life through the lens. I don't have that. I don't have as much money. That can be doing that.
Don't
So
compare yourself to others.
don't
That's
compare yourself to
easy,
others.
easy said than done, though.
Don't compare yourself to others.
Yeah.
That taking that time to really self-reflect is really important for so many different reasons. Pause. How am I actually doing here? What's working well? What do I need to work on? See yourself as a third person. Actually, can be really, really useful here. Sometimes in terms of, because if there are very practical, if there is a practical element of this that you need to look at, seeing yourself in this a third person. When we're doing sometimes things like, isn't it, Nadine, when we're teaching people things like media training, actually what we're doing when we're training them, and often we do playback and so on, we're helping them to begin to see themselves very in the best sense of through a real objective lens of
The
I did
audience.
that well, yeah, of their audience, and I've done that well, do that, that went well, that went well, here's what I need to do. So you can begin, if you can begin to see yourself in that way, and a bit like we might just present, oh, that went well, that thing, next time I might need to, if you can begin to do that, that will really, really help you to be fair in your self-critique. I think then some of those other things we talked about are incredibly important. That network is going to be important, or those safe places where you can open up and share, because it might well be all sorts of things are going on. It might be you just need somebody to talk about the shared challenges that you have. It might well be somebody who's a good peer, that you do that peer mentoring of each other. It might be you need a mentor who's been there and fought the challenges that you fought. That may well be it. It may well be that it's all sorts of things. Yes, you're not treated as though you're welcome. Yes, there isn't the right space. Yes, there's sexism, misogyny, or whatever, or whatever. Or no, it's just a very tough environment in which people are very tough, and that people expected to just show up in one particular style. I think that's going to be really important. And you may not be able to necessarily always find that within your team, within your organization. It might well be you've got those mentors that are kind of outside. Maybe we'll do a separate episode on like who you should have in your peer network on mentoring and all of these kind of things.
Mentoring would be a good one, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Definitely. And how to
mentor
network.
and how
There you
to
go, the
network.
list is growing.
The list is really growing, but I think that these things are really going to be important for you to have, because sometimes it is about just that self-reflecting. But also, one of the other things I would just say that, and this will help you with all of the things, with many of the things that you describe, be it that you're going for that job interview or the promotion, or you're wanting to do well in that next project or whatever. And I recommend people do this on a lot of my courses. Two things. Open a document, call it accomplishments, list everything that you've ever achieved in every single role. Start giving yourself good feedback. And I recommend that people on all of my courses keep and I even do this. I have a folder, an email folder. I call it feedback. Every time that somebody sends something positive about me, I put it in there. I very rarely read it, but put it in there, because
Print it on a mug.
yeah, put it on a mug. Or some I've got a client and they've surrounded themselves with things that they've done and that they've achieved. You might be somebody who needs to visually see it. Sometimes you might be the kind of person you're so focused on the next thing, or you may not see your natural skills because they're just so natural to you. You might need visual reminders. You might need those audio reminders by people saying, you might need to listen to things like this that are just nourishing you. You're going to need to find out as a leader, what are the things that nourish me? Is it at certain moments like we've described where I know I'm going to need that thing to give myself the confidence, or that pep talk with somebody? Is it an ongoing course, or is it that actually, no, this isn't on me, this is the organization that I'm working for, or the team, and then okay, then what am I going to deal with that? But
Yeah.
those are some things that will help.
I think as well, how about comfortable with accepting praise? So someone gives you a compliment, you often hear the but word. Yeah, thank you, but um, stop at the thank you.
Yeah,
You know,
I
so
think
it's
it's
being
important.
humble, but equally that pushing back on praise, and then you start getting into that pattern. I know I tend to do that if someone compliments me on an outfit. I always try and excuse the outfit as though, it's going, just say thank you. So I think we could all be guilty of that. I don't know.
I think it's such an important one, Nadine, to begin to embrace that, to really, when people do say those things, to really embody it and welcome it. Because also, I'd say in leadership, and we'll come onto it, I'm no doubt in a future podcast, this is really important. The ability to give people rich, real, kind, compassionate, constructive feedback that helps people grow is essential. Often people aren't given it, and it might be why people don't value themselves or see their magic, whatever words we round it, or see what their potential is and all of that stuff, because they've never been given that feedback. But equally, it might mean when there are things that people do need to develop, or where there are big problems in the workplace that people don't challenge, because it seems this link, not linked, but in one of our previous podcasts, we touched on some of those inquiries and those scandals and so on that can happen. Very often that's because that there's not been the transparency or that openness, or organizations held to account. So us being able to develop that muscle around giving ourselves good, balanced, kind, compassionate feedback, doing the same thing for our teams and our colleagues and to our organization, is essential, and it's a trademark of a soul leader.
Yeah, that compassion, I think that's a lovely point as we sort of head towards the end of this podcast about being kind to yourself, that you're capable of success and mistakes can happen. That's natural in life as well. So it's not trying to gloss over those errors or mistakes that, you will encounter. Projects and situations will be challenging, but it's actually having the skills to do that. So, sort of finally, if people are thinking, God, this is me, or elements of it is me, or no, there's another part of it that they haven't discussed, but they want to find out more, how can you help people overcome imposter syndrome? I know you've got your soul leader course, and there's all sorts of resources. Obviously, some are complimentary, some are free. Others, if people have got the time and the money to invest in, there's different things for different people. So what can people do?
Yeah, I'd say some things you could do. I mean, head over to soul-trader.biz. There's lots of things there. There are some 3 tips from me on various topics. Actually, one thing that might be really nourishing is listening to those inspiring interviews of other leaders, because I'm quizzing them on them, their journey, the ups and downs. And sometimes when you hear other people who also had that doubt, were unsure, or that moment, could they do this? It can be very powerful. So hearing those stories of other
So
people, I
did you say the soul,
inspiring interviews.
is it on your
Series.
Soul Trader or Soul Leader
Oh, I
website?
beg your pardon. Did I say Soul Trader? Sorry, soul-leader.biz. So on soul-leader.biz, you will find, on the one hand, you'll find some of my short tips on various topics, and you'll find the inspiring interviews. And actually, yeah, those interviews can be so insightful, because the things that you often don't hear, and when sometimes you don't hear the other people's stories, that they've been through the same things as you. So that may well be really helpful when it comes to things like imposter syndrome and other things that just can help you boost your clarity, your confidence, and insight, frankly, in terms of leadership and so on. You may also find, keep an eye out for this ever-growing podcast series, because there may well be many of the linked topics that you might find that they all tend to interlink. Confidence interlinks to this, authenticity has a link to that. So you might find those all very useful. And also, um, many leaders are keen to constantly learn. I would say also, take that time to reflect. Every day in leadership is a leadership journey. Have a sit down on a coffee with somebody you know, like, and respect. What you've been your experiences with this. It might well be something that is very that might be a low hanging fruit you can do. You might want to, if you are a leader, have a conversation around some of these topics. If you've got a safe space with colleagues, with peers, with others, could other topics that we're talking about here that you might also want to begin to have a discussion about within your organization or in your team can be
Yeah,
really powerful
because
as
it's
well.
not only you that might be affected by it, but actually it's your team members. And actually, once you understand that, that explains why, something would maybe have done at the last minute, or why someone's put loads and loads of research into something, over prepared. It could be, it's not necessarily about just coming along and having that lack of confidence because you've winged it or whatever. It could be people who've over prepared, and actually that is very damaging at times as well, for certain situations. So, yeah, I think it's just being alive to it, isn't it? And aware of the fact that imposter syndrome and all that that entails, whether it's situational or really internal to you, and encompassing every part of your life.
That's right. It makes me think of one last thing I want to bring in,
Yeah,
just before I lose it, that it's really important. And it takes us back in a way to where we started. So if we are talking about imposter syndrome, one of the things that Soul Leader does is make everybody feel welcome. If we're making everyone feel welcome and valued, then this thing about imposter syndrome begins to really dissolve, because we feel honored, we feel welcome, we feel safe, we feel seen, we feel heard. So those then, when we think about what's completely different to an imposter, that invitation and that welcome and feeling like a guest or feeling as though we belong, these things we can begin to live as a soul leader. And then it's really important so that we make that space for because otherwise the danger can be, on a low level, you've not thought about, have you welcomed people at the beginning of the meeting? Have you introduced people? Have you invited people to turn their cameras on? There's somebody who's a new member of the team they can't see. So these little things that will either make people feel as though they're not welcome or seen or valued or heard or safe, to them feeling very, very welcome. And that's the opposite. That the soul leader does the complete opposite to imposter syndrome. They make people feel valued, as though they belonged, as though they feel honored, their customers, their colleagues, and so on. So what we want to do is turn that out from being a thing that I'm sitting with. So how can I honor and value every customer, every person who comes through the door, be it in this hospital, in this shop, in this store, online to our organization or agency? Imagine that, because I think whilst we use the word soul, and whilst a lot of the time we will be talking a lot of the time here about you as an individual leader, the soul leader has got work to do. So actually, there is a side in which this might sound like a funny thing for me to say, and it comes up a lot of the time. For example, when I'm teaching people presentation skills, I'll often say, Nadine, to people, also, the, it's make it then all about your audience.
Yeah. And the audience are willing you to do well. That's the
They're
thing.
willing you to
Often
do
people
well.
people often think, oh my goodness, they're not going to like me. They're not going to like, well, I've got to say, so hang on, whoa. Do you know what I mean? They're often thinking about their own issues and challenges. They
Right.
hadn't even given you a second thought as to how you might be feeling
That's right.
inside.
Right.
And
And that
actually,
links, and then
yeah.
that links, doesn't it? What's going on for everybody else? So, having listened to this, what might be going on for the other person who might be nervous, unsure, might be feeling imposter syndrome? So reach out. You can begin to turn that the other way around. Otherwise, we can become so insular that we're not aware of what's going on for the lived experience for all of your colleagues, for all of your peers, for all of your customers, and so on. And you can really turn this around in a really, really rich way, step by step, day by day, moment by moment.
Well, thank you, Rasheed, for being authentic, for being heart-centered and compassionate, which you always are, day in, day out. And I hope you've enjoyed this podcast episode on imposter syndrome. So, Rasheed, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nadine. As always, thank you for the brilliant, probing, rich, and insightful questions. And thanks, everyone, for listening to us. We'll see you next time.
See you.